Cat Rescues Bobcat Kitten, fosters it until the real mother finds her way back. The winter wind cut through the forest with a blade's precision, sending snow devils spinning across the frozen ground of Ely, Minnesota, inside a weathered cabin that had stood for 40 years among the pines. George Ellison woke to a sound that didn't belong. It was 3 in the morning, and the noise came from somewhere deep in the house. A metallic groan that spoke of trouble. At 75, George moved slower than he once had, his joints protesting the cold as he swung his legs out of bed. The power had gone out an hour before, another casualty of the storm that had been building since sunset. He pulled on his heavy coat over his flannel pajamas and felt his way through the darkness toward the utility room, his flashlight casting a narrow beam that seemed swallowed by the shadows. The furnace door hung slightly open. Frost crystallized around its edges in delicate patterns like frozen lace. George knelt with effort, his knees cracking, and peered inside. Ice had formed in thick chunks along the vent pipes, but something else caught his attention. Caught in the grating were several short hairs, their color unmistakable even in the weak light. Sun-bleached yellow, almost golden, stuck fast to the frozen metal like evidence of a search already abandoned. He frowned and ran his fingers over them carefully. These weren't from Marlowe, the white cat who had been his constant companion since Eliza passed 3 years ago. Marlowe's fur was pure as fresh snow, nothing like these coarse, wild strands. George straightened up and called out softly into the darkness of the cabin. "Marlowe, where are you, girl?" Silence answered him, the kind that fills spaces meant for two. He moved through the rooms, flashlight beams sweeping across familiar furniture, the empty rocking chair by the window still holding the shape of absence, the photographs on the mantel showing faces frozen in moments that would never return. But no white cat appeared. George felt the first stirring of worry in his chest, a tightening he recognized from other losses. He pulled on his boots and added another coat, wrapping a scarf around his neck before stepping onto the porch. The wind hit him immediately, stealing his breath. Snow fell in thick curtains, but the warm light spilling from his flashlight and the cabin's kerosene lamps created a golden glow that stretched across the white ground like a path leading into the forest. And there, clear as day despite the falling snow, were tracks, small, delicate paw prints heading straight into the trees, each one a small betrayal of the warmth she'd left behind. George didn't hesitate. He'd lived in these woods long enough to know you didn't leave a cat outside in a storm like this. He followed the tracks, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him, occasionally losing the trail before finding it again. The forest pressed close around him, pine branches heavy with snow bending low enough to brush his shoulders like hands trying to push him back. His breath came harder now, white clouds that dissipated into nothing, his heart working against the cold and the fear that tightened around it. 30 minutes passed, maybe more. Time felt different in the woods at night, stretched thin and distorted, as if the darkness itself fed on minutes and made them hours. George was beginning to doubt his decision to come this far when he heard it, a sound so faint that he almost missed it beneath the wind. A cry, weak and desperate, more whimper than call, the kind of sound that spoke of giving up. He turned toward it, moving carefully around a fallen log, and aimed his flashlight beneath a thick bush at the forest's edge. What he saw made him stop breathing, curled in the snow, trembling violently. Was a bobcat cub. Its fur was matted and wet, plastered to its small frame. But even in its pitiful state, George could see the distinctive marking, just beside its left eye. A teardrop-shaped patch of black fur stood out against the tawny coat, as if the cub wore its sorrow on its face. The cub's eyes were barely open, its breathing shallow, each exhale a small ghost that might be its last. "Lord above," George whispered. Movement caught his eye, and he swung the flashlight to the left. Marlowe emerged from the darkness like a ghost, her white fur barely visible against the snow, as if she were made of the same material as the storm itself. She moved with purpose, ignoring George completely, and went straight to the cub. Without hesitation, she lowered herself and curled her body around the tiny bobcat, pressing close to share what warmth she had. The cub made a sound, something between a chirp and a mew, and burrowed into Marlowe's fur like a child finding its mother after being lost. George stood frozen, his throat tight with emotion. He'd seen a lot in his 75 years, worked as a heating system repairman in homes across 3 counties, raised a son, buried a wife. But this small act of mercy from a house cat to a wild creature, unmade something in him. He knelt carefully and opened his coat wide. "Come on then," he said softly. "Both of you." He gathered them together, Marlowe not resisting, the cub barely conscious, and tucked them against his chest where his own heart could lend its rhythm to theirs. The walk back took longer, his burden precious and fragile. The golden light from the cabin grew brighter as he approached, a beacon in the storm. And when he finally pushed through the door, the warmth hit him like a wave, like forgiveness, like a second chance he hadn't known he was asking for. George worked quickly. He built up the fire in the hearth until it roared, spreading blankets on the floor in front of the flames. Marlowe settled onto them immediately, still cradling the cub against her purr a low thunder that filled the quiet room. George warmed milk in a pan, testing the temperature carefully before offering it. The cub's eyes opened slightly, unseeing, but its mouth found the dropper George used, and it suckled weakly. Each swallow a small victory. "That's it," George murmured. "Just a little more." He stayed with them all night, dozing in his chair, adding wood to the fire, checking on them every few minutes. The cabin breathed around them, wood settling, wind singing through cracks, the fire popping and hissing its ancient song. By the time dawn broke gray and cold through the windows, painting the snow outside in shades of pearl and silver, the cub had lifted its head and was drinking more steadily. Marlowe groomed it with her tongue, patient and thorough, as if she'd done this 100 times before, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. George watched them and made a decision. The cub needed a name. He studied the sun-damaged fur, the distinctive teardrop mark, and thought of his son, who had died in a training accident 20 years ago. His son, who had flown jets, who had loved the sky and speed and the roar of engines. The mark by the cub's eye reminded him of the tear-shaped insignia on those planes, but also of something else. The way grief marks you. The way loss writes itself on your face where everyone can see. "Jet," he said aloud. "I'll call you Jet." The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Jet grew stronger, her appetite increasing, her movements becoming less shaky. Marlowe never left her side for long, this white guardian who had claimed a wild thing as her own. George watched in amazement as the bobcat cub began to mimic the cat's behaviors. Jet scratched at the furniture the same way Marlowe did, earning a scolding from George that made him laugh even as he delivered it. She rubbed against his legs when he walked through the kitchen, nearly tripping him the first few times, her body a warm weight that reminded him he was still needed. Most surprisingly, she learned to use the litter box, watching Marlowe carefully before attempting it herself, this wild creature learning the rules of domestic life. But it was the trust that moved George most. At first, Jet had flinched away from his hands, her wild instincts telling her to fear humans. But she watched Marlowe, watched how the white cat would jump into George's lap for scratches, how she nuzzled his hand every morning when he came downstairs. Slowly, over days and then weeks, Jet began to approach him, first just sniffing his fingers, testing the air around him for danger, then allowing a brief touch, her body tensing but not fleeing. Finally, one evening as George sat reading by the fire, Jet climbed onto the couch beside him and rested her head on his knee, a gesture so trusting it brought tears to his eyes. George's hand trembled as he stroked the soft fur, feeling the warmth and weight of this impossible trust, this bridge built between wild and tame. There were funny moments too. One afternoon, Jet sat beside Marlowe and seemed to be studying her intently, the way a student watches a master. Marlowe meowed, a clear, bright sound that rang through the cabin like a bell. Jet opened her mouth and made an attempt to copy it. What came out was somewhere between a squeak and a grunt, a sound so absurd that George laughed until his sides hurt and his eyes watered. Jet looked confused, her head tilting. Marlowe turned away and began grooming herself, as if embarrassed on Jet's behalf, her tail twitching with what might have been amusement. Jet tried again, producing another mangled approximation that was nothing like a proper meow. Her throat not built for such sounds. Eventually, she gave up and made the chirping sound that came naturally to bobcats. Seeming satisfied with that, and Marlowe looked back as if to say, "Yes, that's better. Be yourself, Caleb." George's grandson visited every few days. He was a forest ranger, familiar with wildlife, and when George first told him about Jet over the phone, Caleb had been skeptical. "Grandpa, house cats don't raise wild animals. It doesn't work that way." "Come see for yourself," George had said. When Caleb arrived and saw Jet curled up with Marlowe by the fire, both of them looking at him with similar expressions of mild interest, as if he were the strange one for being surprised, he sat down hard on the nearest chair. "I'll be damned," he breathed. "Language," George said automatically. But he was smiling. Caleb visited more often after that, fascinated by the unlikely pair. One evening, about 2 months after George had found Jet, Caleb arrived with his laptop, his face carrying that expression George recognized from when the boy had been young and discovered something that changed how he saw the world. "I've been thinking about how Jet ended up out there alone," he said, opening the computer on the kitchen table. "The Silver Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary has cameras set up all through this area. I got permission to access the footage from the night you found her." George pulled his chair closer as Caleb pulled up the thermal imaging files. The footage was eerie, showing the forest in shades of orange and red against a blue-black background, a world of heat and cold with nothing in between. Heat signatures moved through the frame, and Caleb narrated what they were seeing. "This is from about 6 hours before you found Jet," he said, pointing to a large shape moving quickly through the trees. "Adult bobcat. See the smaller signature? That's a cub, and this one here, that's a fox." They watched as the adult bobcat, clearly Jet's mother, led the fox away from where the cub huddled beneath a bush. The mother moved with purpose, drawing the predator farther and farther away, sacrificing her position to save her young, until both disappeared from the camera's range, swallowed by the dark forest. "She saved her baby," George said quietly. "Look at this," Caleb said, advancing the footage. "This is about 3 hours later." The camera showed the same area. The small heat signature that was Jet remained motionless beneath the bush, growing dimmer, cooling. Then, from the opposite direction, another shape appeared, smaller than the adult bobcat, moving cautiously. It approached the cub and stopped. And George could imagine that moment of decision, that choice between safety and compassion. "That's Marlowe," Caleb said, his voice filled with wonder. They watched as Marlowe stood still, as if uncertain what to do, as if weighing the cost of caring. The cub moved slightly, and even without sound, George could imagine the weak cries, that universal language of need. Then Jet, using what must have been the last of her strength, crawled a short distance and pressed herself against Marlowe's belly, choosing life, choosing trust. Caleb fast-forwarded slightly. "Watch what happens next." The snow gets worse. The thermal image showed the white cat standing. The cub pressed against her. Marlowe looked around, then began moving, nudging the cub along with her. The snow was falling harder now, visible even in the thermal imaging as a distortion in the air. Marlowe led Jet away from the exposed area, deeper into a cluster of rocks and fallen timber, where an overhang provided shelter. "She moved her," George said. "Smart cat. Now look at this." Caleb switched to another camera, one closer to George's property. The timestamp showed about an hour after Marlowe had moved Jet. A large heat signature appeared, moving frantically. The adult bobcat, returning, she went straight to the bush where her cub had been, circling it, searching. Then she began to range outward, her movements desperate, covering ground in wider and wider arcs. "The mother came back," Caleb said. But Jet wasn't there anymore. They watched as the bobcat's search pattern took her through the woods, past the camera's range, then picked up again by another camera near the property line. She was at George's woodpile now, moving around it, sniffing. Then she approached the cabin itself, coming right up to the utility room wall. "That's where you found those hairs," Caleb said. George nodded. watching the mother bobcat press close to the vent, her body rubbing against the metal as she searched for any trace of her cub. But Jet wasn't inside yet. She was still sheltered in the rocks with Marlowe, nearly a quarter mile away. The mother eventually moved on, her search taking her back into the forest, following trails that led nowhere. As winter deepened into February, Caleb installed a motion detector system around the cabin. George had been forgetting things lately, small things mostly, where he'd put his glasses, what day of the week it was, whether he'd eaten lunch. Caleb worried about him being out here alone and thought the cameras might help. Connected to George's phone so he could check on things, but the system revealed something unexpected. One evening, Caleb came over and pulled up the footage from the previous night. George watched as a large shape appeared at the edge of the clearing. A bobcat, adult, female. She approached the cabin slowly, stopping about 20 feet from the windows where the light fell across the snow like an offering. Then she sat down and remained motionless, a statue carved from shadow and patience. "How long did she stay?" George asked. Caleb checked the timestamp. 3 hours, just sitting there, looking at the cabin. She did this twice last week, too, always during storms. George felt something shift in his chest, an understanding clicking into place. It's her mother, Astra. Astra. That's what I'm calling her. She's looking for Jet. They studied the footage more carefully. The bobcat's posture wasn't aggressive. She didn't pace or claw at anything. She simply sat and watched, her gaze fixed on the warm light glowing through the windows. On this place where her daughter had disappeared to. Finally, as the footage showed, she stood and disappeared back into the forest, leaving only tracks that the next snow would erase. "She knows Jet is here," George said. "She's been watching, waiting." Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath like secrets coming to light. Jet grew rapidly, her legs lengthening, her shoulders broadening with muscle. She was unmistakably wild now, her movements filled with a grace and power that no house cat could match. But she was still gentle with Marlowe, still followed George around the cabin, still slept by the fire at night, caught between two worlds. Yet something was changing. George noticed it first on the clear evenings. Jet would sit by the window for hours, staring out at the forest, her body rigid with longing. Her ears would swivel, catching sounds George couldn't hear. Conversations in a language he'd never learned. Sometimes she would make that chirping call, soft and questioning, as if expecting an answer that never came. One night, an answer came. George was preparing for bed when Jet suddenly stood rigid at the window, every muscle tense, her whole body a question mark. Marlowe joined her, both of them looking out into the darkness, both hearing what George could not. Then, faint but unmistakable, a sound drifted through the trees, a chirp, deeper and more resonant than Jet's. The distinctive call of an adult bobcat summoning her young, a sound that carried across generations, across the divide between wild and tame. Jet's ears shot forward. She made a sound George had never heard from her before, something between a chirp and a cry. Urgent and longing, the sound of recognition and remembering. The call came again, closer this time, patient and insistent. George stood in the middle of his living room and understood what was happening, understood what needed to happen. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, but he walked to the door and opened it wide. The golden light from inside spilled across the porch and onto the snow, creating that same path he had followed months ago, only now the path led away instead of toward him. "I know," he said quietly, though whether he was talking to Jet or Marlowe or himself, he couldn't say. For the next several nights, George opened the door every evening. He left it open long enough for the light to spread across the snow like an invitation. A way home, though home now meant something different. Jet would sit on the porch steps, staring at that golden path, torn between two worlds, two loves, two versions of herself. Caleb came by one afternoon and showed George the camera footage from the past week. Tracks surrounded the cabin, dozens of them, all from the same adult bobcat, circling but never quite approaching, a pattern of waiting and hoping. Some came within feet of the porch. In one clip, they could see Astra herself, sitting at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin, her eyes reflecting the camera's flash like small moons. "She's been coming every night," Caleb said. "She's persistent." George called just over and led her outside to the tracks. Jet sniffed each one carefully, her whole body quivering, her tail standing straight up, her ears stood straight up. She made a chirping sound, then another, growing more agitated, her paws kneading the snow. She understood. Her mother had been here, was still here, waiting, had never stopped waiting. The next night was rare for March, clear and still, the moon nearly full, hanging in the sky like a witness. George sat in his chair by the window, Marlowe in his lap, and watched Jet pace restlessly, wearing a path in the floor. The sounds of the forest drifted through the walls. Owls called to each other, their voices rising and falling like questions and answers. The wind whispered through new leaves, carrying secrets. And beneath it all, the low calls of animals settling in for the night, a symphony of the wild. Jet climbed onto the windowsill, her eyes fixed on the tree line, her body silhouetted against the glass. George held his breath. Then it came, the chirp of a mother calling her young, a sound Jet had heard as a tiny cub, a sound buried deep in her memory and her blood, a sound that meant safety and belonging and home. Jet's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She cried back, a series of chirps that grew louder and more desperate, her whole body straining toward the sound. Marlowe jumped down from George's lap and went to sit beside Jet. They looked at each other, these two unlikely companions who had saved each other in different ways, who had built something together that neither could have built alone. George stood slowly and walked to the door. His hands shook as he pulled it open. The golden light poured out, brighter than usual in the darkness, stretching across the snow all the way to the forest's edge, a river of warmth in the cold night. From behind a large pine tree, a shape emerged. Astra stepped into the light, her fur silver gold in the glow, her eyes fixed on the cabin, bright and intelligent. She was magnificent, larger than George had imagined, her movements fluid and powerful, every inch the wild creature her daughter was meant to become. She stopped halfway across the clearing and sat down, waiting, giving Jet the choice. Jet looked back at George, then at Marlowe, then at the forest and her mother. George's throat was so tight he could barely speak. "Go on, Jet. You belong out there." Jet moved to Marlowe first, touching noses with the white cat, a gesture they'd shared hundreds of times, a ritual of connection. Marlowe made a soft sound, not quite a meow, more of a sigh, the sound of letting go. She lifted one paw and touched Jet's face, just for a moment, a blessing. Then she stepped back and sat down, giving permission, releasing what she'd never really owned. Jet turned to George. She approached him slowly and pressed her head against his leg one last time. George reached down with a trembling hand and touched the teardrop mark beside her eye, feeling the soft fur, memorizing it, storing it somewhere deeper than memory. "Be safe," he whispered. "Be happy. Remember you're loved." Jet stepped off the porch and into the snow. She moved slowly at first, then faster, and then she was running, kicking up powder in her wake, her body stretching and contracting with each bound. Astra stood as Jet approached, and when they met, the mother bobcat did something George had only read about. She groomed Jet's head thoroughly, checking her over, making small sounds, relearning her daughter through scent and touch. Jet pressed against her mother, and for a long moment, they were simply together, two halves made whole. Then Astra turned and walked back toward the forest. Jet followed without looking back. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the trees, leaving only tracks in the snow. Evidence that something real had happened here, something that couldn't be explained away. George stood on the porch, watching the place where they'd vanished, tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. He had spent his life learning to let go, letting go of his son Daniel to the endless Alaska ski tour, letting go of Eliza to illness that no love could cure, and now letting go of Jet to the wild where she belonged. Each goodbye had felt like losing a piece of his heart. But this time was different. This wasn't loss, it was completion. Jet wasn't being taken from him. She was returning to where she'd always belonged, carrying with her the love and safety he and Marlo had given her during those precious months. The love they'd given Jet would ripple forward now, into her future, into the cubs she might have, into generations yet to come. That was the true gift, not keeping, but giving freely. George stood still for a long time, tears streaming down his face, freezing on his cheeks. Marlo came out and sat beside him, and together they watched the empty forest, this space that had swallowed something precious. The golden light still spilled across the snow, but the path was empty now, leading nowhere. "We did a good thing," George said to Marlo, his voice breaking. "Didn't we?" Marlo rubbed against his ankle and made a small sound of agreement. Or maybe grief, or maybe both. Spring turned to summer. Summer became autumn. Autumn froze into winter again. George maintained his ritual every evening, opening the door and letting the light spread across the snow. He didn't know why he kept doing it. Jet was gone, returned to her wildlife where she belonged. But something in him needed to keep that path lit, needed to believe that connection still mattered. That love didn't end just because the loved one walked away. Caleb visited regularly, bringing groceries, checking on his grandfather. George was forgetting more now. He'd put milk in the cupboard and cereal in the refrigerator. He'd forget what day it was, sometimes what month, occasionally even what season. The calendar in his mind jumbling together like cards shuffled wrong. Once, Caleb found him standing in the yard at 2 in the morning, confused about why it was dark, looking for something he couldn't name. "You should come stay with us, Grandpa," Caleb said gently. "Sarah and the kids would love to have you." "I'm fine here," George insisted. "George, I have Marlo. This is my home." And he always remembered to turn on the porch light at sunset. That routine never faltered, even when everything else did. This one constant in a world that was slowly becoming unfamiliar. 2 years passed, then 3, then 5. George was 80 now, his body failing in small ways that added up to something larger. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, the world reduced to shapes and shadows. His hearing was muffled, as if he lived underwater. His memory was a patchwork thing, more holes than fabric, more absence than presence. But Marlo stayed by his side, older herself, moving slower, sleeping more, her fur now more cream than white. Caleb told his wife that the cat seemed to be watching over George, alert when he was confused, guiding him back to his chair when he wandered, as if she knew she was all that stood between him and complete loss. "That house has 2 souls in it," Caleb said. "They're taking care of each other." On a bright spring morning, George sat in his rocking chair by the window. The sunlight was warm on his face, but his eyes couldn't make sense of the shapes beyond the glass. Everything was soft and blurred, colors bleeding together like watercolors left in the rain. He felt peaceful, though, comfortable. Marlo was somewhere nearby. He could hear her bell, the one Eliza had put on her collar years ago, a sound that had become the soundtrack of his solitude. Then Marlo did something she rarely did anymore. She jumped down from her spot on the couch and ran, actually ran, to the door. She pawed at it frantically, making sounds George couldn't remember hearing from her before, urgent sounds that pulled him from his chair. "What is it, girl?" George asked, confused. "You want out?" He stood slowly, using the arm of the chair for support, and made his way to the door. His hands fumbled with the latch before finally pulling it open. Marlo shot out onto the porch, her movements suddenly young again, energetic, as if years had fallen away like a coat she no longer needed. George stepped outside, squinting against the brightness. He could make out shapes, nothing clear, but movement. Marlo was doing something, rubbing against something tall. He heard sounds, chirping and soft chuffs, familiar somehow, pulling at memories that wouldn't quite surface. Then a shape separated from the others and moved toward him, something large, tawny, moving with purpose but without aggression. It climbed the porch steps and approached him directly, without fear, as if it belonged here. George's heart began to pound. He reached out instinctively, and his hand met warm fur. The creature pressed its head into his palm, and George's fingers found what they were searching for, what some part of him had never stopped searching for. A marking, textured slightly different from the surrounding fur, teardrop-shaped, beside the left eye. The world snapped into focus, just for a moment. Not his vision, but his mind. Sharp and clear in a way it hadn't been for months, as if this moment was important enough to burn through the fog. "Jet," his voice cracked. "Is that you, the bobcat?" Because that's what it was. A full-grown female bobcat made a sound, that chirp, deeper now but unmistakably the same. The sound he'd heard every day for those precious months. She pressed harder against his hand, answering a question he'd been asking for 5 years. "You came back," George whispered. Sinking down onto the porch step, Jet moved with him, never breaking contact. "After all this time, you came back." Moved mad at the edge of the porch caught his attention. His vision was blurring again. Reality softening around the edges, but he could make out smaller shapes. 3 of them, watching curiously, ears forward, tails twitching. "You brought your babies," George said, understanding flooding through him like light through a window. "You brought them here." Jet settled beside him, and one by one, her cubs ventured closer. They were bolder than Jet had been at first, curious about this old man and the white cat who was touching noses with their mother, who was purring loud enough to shake the porch boards. The smallest one climbed right into George's lap, and he laughed, the sound rusty but genuine, a sound he thought he'd forgotten how to make. "Marlo," he called, and the white cat came to him. She climbed onto the porch railing, surveying the scene with what George would have sworn was satisfaction, as if this was what she'd been waiting for all along. "You knew, didn't you? You knew she'd come back." The golden light from the doorway spilled across the porch and onto the snow beyond, just like it had that first night 5 years ago. That first night when George had followed those small tracks into the forest and found a dying cub and a miracle. The light created a path, just like always, stretching toward the forest, warm and inviting. But now the path led both ways. George sat with his family. This impossible, wonderful family he'd somehow been given. An old man, an elderly white cat, a wild bobcat who had once been saved, and 3 new lives full of possibility. The morning sun warmed them all, and George felt something he hadn't felt in years. Complete. George looked out at the golden light still spilling across the porch, connecting his home to the wild world beyond. He understood now what he had been doing in all these years, not waiting for Jet to return and stay, but maintaining a connection, keeping a promise that love doesn't demand presence. "You brought them to the right place," he said softly, his hand resting on Jet's head while the cubs explored around them. "You showed them where love lives." Jet pressed closer to his leg. Marlo moved among the cubs with the satisfaction of a matriarch whose act of mercy had created ripples across generations. The cabin behind them stood open, its golden light still flowing outward, not as a summons now, but as a promise. The boundary between wild and tame, George realized, was not a wall but a path that could be traveled in both directions, lit by love strong enough to survive any separation, any winter, any passage of time. And that light would continue to burn through seasons yet to come, through the long winters ahead, not demanding return, but promising welcome. The kind of love that asks nothing in return, the kind that simply says, "You are remembered, you are cherished, you will always have a way home." Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.